test of the microphones, everybody. I guess you can. Oh, good morning, everybody. I'm Councillor Eric Kerry and I'd like to welcome you to the annual general meeting of the Nottinghamshire Pension Fund Committee. And I'd like to wish you all a very happy new year and hope you all had a great Christmas. This meeting is being broadcast live on YouTube, so that viewers can hear the presentation and questions in today's meeting. Please make sure you turn on your microphone when you wish to speak. The microphones are sensitive, so please remember to turn them off again when you've finished speaking, and that includes me. Before we begin the meeting, I'd like to remind those members of the public that are present that placards, banners, advertising materials, similar items are not permitted in any committee meeting and must be covered or removed. Failure to comply may result in members of the public being asked to leave the meeting. Members of the public should remain seated during any debate and not do anything to endanger the health and safety of any person. Members of the public may record proceedings and report all public meetings. Any person recording the meeting must not disrupt the good order of the meeting. Mobile phones and other electronic devices must be switched to silent, please. And I think that completes my opening statement. So we'll move on to item number 2, which is apologies to absence. And can I ask Joe Toomey to confirm any apologies and substitutes, please?
Thank you. Today we have an apology from Councillor Khan from Nottingham City Council and from Yvonne Davidson, who is one of the trade union representatives who will formally note her membership at the next meeting.
Thank you, Joe. Any members or officers aware of any other apologies, please? I see no indications. Thank you. Item number 3, declarations of interest by members and officers. A, do any members or officers present have any disclosable pecuniary interests to declare, please? Okay, no indications. B, do any members or officers present have any private interests, either pecuniary or non-pecuniary, to declare, please? Again, I see none. Moving on to item number 4 then, it's the notes of the previous year's meeting, which we held on the 17th of January 2022. So members you've all read the notes, I'm sure. Can you confirm that the notes of the AGM on the 17th of 2022 a true record of what then took place? I've got 2 hands up. Councillor Garner. I thought you were indicating to speak. Not wishing to speak? Okay. So can just see indications from the voting members, please. Okay. Thank you very much. That's carried. Okay, moving on to a very substantial item on the agenda is item number 5. It's our actuarial issues and from Barnet Waddingham, and the presentation will be delivered by Barry McKay. And welcome here today, Barry. Nice to see you in person again after a few years of COVID, etc., and not being able to happen. So, can I just ask you to proceed? Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. Good morning, everyone. I'm Chair, Sir, I'm Barry McKay. I'm the Fund Actuary from Barnet Waddingham. And over the last 6 to 9 months, we've been carrying out the actual evaluation, which is the biggest piece of work we do for the fund. Very important piece of work, and I'll go on to describe why. Obviously, you're looking after £6.5 billion of assets. We need to keep that under review. A bit of an anecdote from my travels here last night to prove the point. I flew to Birmingham. I was in 2 minds which train to get, one that went directly to Nottingham and one that changed at Derby. I had to make a change at Derby, and funnily enough, the one at Derby was quicker, so I thought, well, I'll get that train and I'll just change. But I started checking the valuation report, and the law of actuary works so much that I get so engrossed that I missed my stop. And the conductor came along and said, "Tickets, please." And only then I realised I was at Chesterfield, and the next stop was in Wakefield, I think. So I spent about another 40 minutes going up the track, half an hour at Wakefield station, and another 40 minutes back down the track. So the point of the story is this is why we carry, this is why we review and monitor and look after the liabilities and assets of the fund and carry out actual valuations. Because if you don't keep your eye on the ball, like me, then there's a risk of making a complete mess of things. So that's the reason we carry out the actual valuation. But on a more serious note, this is what we'll talk about today. If you go on the next slide, please.
Let's just ask Barry, would you like questions during the presentation, or would you like to leave it to the end?
Yeah, I have to take questions during. Yes. So this is what we'll cover today. What's the valuation, and more importantly, what are the outcomes from that valuation? They actually has to make lots of assumptions about the future to be able to place a value on what we call the liabilities. We'll explain those in a moment. And so we propose assumptions to the officers of the fund and discuss and agree that we're happy with those. And I'll talk about those assumptions and how we've come up with them. And then I'll go into how the whole fund results are looking as at 31st March 2022. We're obviously more than 9 months on from that, and there's been lots of turmoil in that period as always. But these are the results for the whole fund back at that date. The next slide, thanks. So what's the valuation? Effectively, we take the market value of assets that the fund is holding, so you invest in lots of different asset classes, equity, properties, bonds, and so on, and we take the assets you have in the fund, and we have to then place a value on all the members' benefits that have accrued up to the valuation date, and that's what we term the value we place on the liabilities. And I'll explain how we do that in a second, but once we've done that, we know what the value of the liabilities are, we know what the value of the assets are, and what that tells us is the first key outcome is what we term the funding position. So the funding position or funding level is the ratio of the assets to the liabilities. And if the assets exceed the liabilities, you'll be more than 100% funded and you'll have a surplus. And if the assets are less than the liabilities, so in other words, all the money we think you pay out to all your members in the future, if that's more than the assets, then you don't have enough money, and therefore the funding level will be less than 100% and you'll have a deficit. So we do that for the whole fund, but we also do it for every participating employer in the fund. And they have their own pot of assets, which we allocate out from the fund's assets, and they have their own membership, and therefore their own liability, because they have their own benefits to pay, albeit the fund do it on their behalf. So we work out what the funding level is for the whole fund and for every employer in the fund. And then the second outcome is the most important one for employers, which is the contribution rate, so the cost of the scheme, how much it's going to cost them over the next 3 years. And so the valuation tells us what they need to pay for the next 3 years, and that's payable with effect from 1st of April 2023 through to 31st March 2026. There's two parts to the contribution rate. There's what we call the primary rate. It's not terribly helpful terminology. It used to be called the future service cost. So the cost of the benefits will accrue from the valuation date going forward, because all the actors will be accruing more benefit. And then there's the secondary rate, which is an adjustment depending on the outcome of what we just spoke about a second ago, their funding level. So back to the point, if they've got a deficit, a debt, a shortfall, then they'll need to pay extra contributions in to make good that debt. So the total contribution rate will be a bit higher than the primary rate. And then if they've got a surplus, then they might be able to use some of that surplus to reduce the rate. Not always, but sometimes, depending on various other employer characteristics and so on. And therefore they might get a slight reduction in the total rate. But one of the key objectives of the action is to keep the contribution rates as stable as possible for employers in the fund. In the regulations, it says we have to keep the primary rate stable, but we try and keep the total contribution rate stable. I think that makes more sense. So if we go on to the next slide, this is largely done, and you might think, why am I showing you? Why does it matter? Because most of it's in the past. The point is just to show you how much work goes into the valuation by your fund, your officers, and by your advisors. So the process kicks off. It probably kicked off more than a year ago now, and we get to the valuation date, and then we get data in usually in the summer, and we crunch all the data, and then we start running results in September, October time for the employers. And obviously now we're at the stage where all the results have been issued. Hopefully most of the employers are happy with the contribution rates and the position. And we've still got a few months to finish off the whole project, which needs to be completed by 31st March 2023. But yeah, we're well on track. So we just need to finalise what's called the funding strategy statement, which goes out for consultation to employers, and then we need to draft up the formal valuation report and rates, what we call the rates and adjustment certificate. So that's where it lists all the costs to the employers. Move on again. So how do we? I've probably talked a bit about this already. How do we actually carry out the funding valuation? I kind of call it funding because there's different types of valuation. You've got accounting and so on. But this is the one that I think matters to the fund, because this is a check on your solvency level and how much money you're going to get coming in from employers' contributions and employee contributions. So as I said already, we compare the assets you're holding against what we call the financial value of all the pension promises, the liabilities. And how we do that is we need to, because we've got assets at market value today, we need to project forward all the benefit payments that are going to be made and then bring them all back to today, so that we're comparing apples with apples. So we've got the assets of today and we've got the liabilities of today. And we do that through an actuarial technique called discounting. But I'll talk again a bit more about that in a second when we get to the assumptions. And then I've already said that we track all the employers separately. So some of those may be pooled, like academies. Pooling is just a form of insurance where you put all the assets and liabilities in together and set the funding level and the contribution rate as for those employers as a group. Okay.
Barry, I think Councillor Chapman would like to ask a question.
Yeah, I actually put the light on for the previous, but you're on a roll. I don't think the chair was far too polite to interrupt it. What I was interested in is the timescale. Right? Somebody that's working with a number of councils that on their budgets, and I have been responsible for a budget. The timing has always been a real problem, because councils are making their budgets in November, December, right? And they have therefore got to make assumptions about how much their pension contribution is going to be. Right. And then eventually they'll look by this, they'll find the results into April and the following year. So what the problem then is that, sometimes the assumptions are wrong. And sometimes, particularly this year, I've got an example of one council who is probably making. I think they're going to get a reduction in their contributions by about 5 million, but that's an assumption. Now, other councils are not taking that line, right, and they're making cuts in frontline services, right, as waiting for the see what happens with the evaluations. And it just seems to me that the whole timing, right, from the point of view of the council, not particularly the pension fund, is just out of sync. And if actually you could get your valuation in November, so the councils knew what they were doing and how much contributions they had to make, it would save an awful lot of trouble.
Come back on that. Yeah, so we can. I think we did probably the first draft of the council results in November. I appreciate the problem part of back in the timetable chart we saw we don't get data till because the data can't be renewed until May time, we can't get it till June time, and then it takes a bit of time to validate the data and check it's fit for purpose, and then crunch the numbers, agree the assumptions with the officers, and then go back and crunch the numbers for the employers. So it does take a bit of time, and certainly we have had this issue with other employer groups as well, not just council, I guess. And we do our best to give results as quickly as possible. The second thing, as I said, we try and keep contributions stable. So probably a sort of working budget might be to assume that the contribution rate is going to be broadly what you're paying at the moment. Then you wouldn't be far away. That might not always be the case, but that's what we try and do, particularly for councils, which are long-term bodies in the fund, and therefore we can take a long-term view.
Yeah, if I may, Chairman, I mean, and Keith might come in and correct me if I get this wrong, but in the past there has been a particular concern in terms of the pension fund, for instance, in terms of valuations, that it has come late, and we've tried as best as we can to bring that cycle forward as much as we can, so that we can identify, or at least give to the main employers an indication of what their rates are going to be like before Christmas, knowing that the budget cycle, that we don't want to be this in January, late January or early February, which has been some years ago, probably about 9 years ago when that sort of incident happened. We've definitely been trying to recognise that incident, particularly because the county council ends up in that same situation as well, because we have to set our budgets earlier in the cycle than the other main employees in this. So that's what we've tried to do. But you have to recognise, as Barry says, it's an awful lot of checking of the data and making sure that the year-end data from the employers is correct. A lot of validation checks that have to take place. So that's the earliest that the cycle actually starts, as Barry says, until June, because to making sure that the data is correct. Because the last thing you want to do is go through this process where you're going early with data that you know is going to be wrong and correct it, because you're back to the same position you were in terms of waiting for the data to be correct. So, but like I say, a lot of effort has been taken to make sure that data is correct as far as those main employers as well. So that's part of that data. But unless, Keith, there was anything else, that I think we've tried our best to bring this cycle as early as we can in terms of the data. And I know then John wants to mention something.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's the main employers that we focus on, certainly district councils and city council. There are also issues associated with delays in audit as well. That's caused us some problems over this year in particular, because the audit doesn't take place until later than it has in previous years. But we sort of do everything we can, I think.
Okay, Councillor Chapman, I think, does that answer your question? I know it's not a perfect result. You'd like to know the numbers when you do that. However, I think it's about having confidence in the system and process, isn't it? And I think so long as we're doing the best we can. I'd like to ask a question of the admin side, really. So with the pensions dashboard and the improvement of data in the future, part of our improvement strategy, is that going to help getting early results?
Yeah. Starting off, just to answer one of the questions, Chair, and it will be in my presentation, but we have to start collecting the data from April onwards, and we start talking to scheme employers in January in relation to their data to be produced by the end of the year. And I think I've always reported, I can say for 21-22, we had 87% of our returns returned by the actual submission date, which was the 9th of May, but 53% of it was accurate, so we had to send that back. And that's one of the problems that we encounter. So running up to producing our benefit statements and then producing data for the valuation, we're into the end of July. So we are looking at how we can improve that, and the way that we're going to do that is move to monthly returns, and we're kicking off a project this or next month in relation to moving to monthly returns to try and get that data as early as we possibly can.
Councillor Introna? No? Okay. So I asked that question, Councillor Chapman, especially because it's not as simple as just the actuaries and us doing their work. It is more complex, and obviously we'll try and, as we try and improve that, hopefully you'll see improvements. I don't see any more. So do you want to carry on? Yeah.
Thanks. So last point on that, I do have one idea that'll maybe float past the fund to help with that budgeting, but we're probably too late for this time, but for next time. And it would take out that data problem, but we'll come back to you on that. Okay, so quick, the next couple of slides are just on how we, a bit more detail, how we value liabilities for each employer and how we allocate the assets. Looking at the liabilities first, we've just been talking lots about the data. We need good quality, accurate, complete data to start from. Otherwise, it's the old adage of putting rubbish in, you get rubbish out. So we need really good data, and we once we've validated that and we're happy with it, that goes into our valuation system. But as I said, we need to make lots of assumptions, and the thing I always say, and Councillor Chapman's already said it for me, actually, the only thing I can be sure about is the assumptions will be wrong. Now, we'll definitely get the assumptions wrong because we are making assumptions about inflation, economic growth, investment returns, salary increases, mortality, retirement dates, so on and so on. And they are our best guesses, our best estimates as based on the data we have. And the other point to make is they're very, very long term. So a good example at the moment is we know inflation's high. We know it's going to be really high in April, which is when the pension increase applies to the LGPS. We know it's going to be around 10% unless the government do something drastic and change their mind on that. And so when you see our assumptions later, you'll think, why is it so low? But the point is that our assumptions are looking out 10, 20, 30 years because this is a very long-term funding plan. It's a long-term scheme. So the point is that we're trying to get over the long term, trying to capture both short-term fluctuations and the general long-term trend. So there's two sets of financial assumptions. One group's called financial assumptions, which will impact the amount of benefit that's paid out to each member, things like inflation and salary increases. And the other group is demographic, and that determines the likelihood of it being paid, when it comes into payment, and for how long. So things like when will people retire and how will they retire, early retirement date or normal retirement date, and then how long will they live for. So once we've got our data and we've made our assumptions, we go back to the office and churn all the numbers through a model, and that produces a liability for each and every member in your fund, so actors, deferrers and pensioners. And then by summing them all up in different ways, we can get results for employers and results for the whole fund. That's really quite complicated, and to describe it in 2 minutes is not really doing it justice, but that's part of the reason this valuation takes so long. The assets on the other side on the other hand are relatively simple for us, and it works a bit like a bank account. We know what the assets are for the fund as a whole. We know what each employer had were allocated assets at the last valuation 3 years ago. We know the cash flow is being paid in. We know the contributions going in, and we know the benefits getting paid out. And therefore, it works very much like a bank account, where you've got money at the start, you pay some money in, you pay some money back out, you get interest. So in this case, the investment return on the assets held by the fund. And then 3 years later, we know what the assets are for each employer. So it's just been rolled forward for 3 years with those cash flows and interest. So that gives us the assets for each employer at the end of the period, and we know the liabilities. So that's a very quick summary of how we carry out the valuation. Any questions at that point before I move on to section 2? No. Okay. So now we'll look at the proposed assumptions. We produced a whole report on this, which is boiled down to this table. So we did lots of this. Again, there's a lot of work that goes into this, lots of analysis, lots of gathering of information in terms of what markets are predicting, economists are predicting, what our own investment colleagues are saying. And these are the main, I've only highlighted the main assumptions we use here, but these are the key financial assumptions.
Thank you, Chairman. I was just wondering what impact, if any, did the government's mini budget have on the fund assumptions, and do you believe employer contributions will need to increase due to the impact of the mini budget?
Okay, so short answer is that the funding level, the assets, the ratio of assets to liabilities, didn't change that much because of the mini budget, and that is because there's a couple of elements from the mini budget. I'm sure Tamsin and William would say more, but obviously we know gilt yields went shooting up. Now, in a private sector environment, that's a big deal a lot of the time because they have LDI, as you've probably read about, and so on. Your fund, the LGPS in general, your fund doesn't have a link necessarily to gilt yields. You don't have a lot of money invested in gilt, so it doesn't have a big impact on assets. And we don't set our investment return or discount rate, as we call it here, based on gilt yields either. So that didn't have a big impact on the assumptions or the liabilities. The second element, of course, was it did play a bit of havoc with the markets for a while, and they were a bit volatile, but then they've settled down, and it's back to this point about being a very long-term investor and a very long-term scheme. One of the things we do when we look at the valuation is to look at market conditions for 6 months, spanning the valuation date. So we look at gilt yields, for example, and lots of other market indicators from the 1st of January to the 30th of June in the year of the valuation. And the very reason we do that is to try and smooth out some of the volatility in markets, so that when we set assumptions, they are for the long term, that produces more stable contribution rates. A great example would have been if we'd had to carry out a valuation at 2020 when the pandemic had just broke and asset values had plummeted by 15% or so. If we'd been carrying out a valuation 31st March 2020, the funding level would have looked pretty bad. But in fact, 2 months later, by the end of May, assets had rebounded and we were kind of back to where we were. And therefore, these short-term volatile situations, we want to kind of smooth over those, because we shouldn't be chopping and changing every 5 minutes. So these are the key financial assumptions. The big one, or the big two, have been CPI, inflation, and the discount rate. Now,
Sorry.
Yes, Andre.
Yeah, is that all right? Yeah. Looking at the FTSE at present today, it's the highest it's been. I mean, it's gone up over 10% since the mini budget. So inflation's starting to level out and come down. So the future is looking quite good, I should think. I don't know. Have you got any comment on that? I mean, things are starting to settle down. You're getting a bit more management in the economy, and things are looking better. I mean, the FTSE has gone absolutely mad. I mean, it's gone up. I think it's over 10% in 3 months, which is quite unbelievable to say. We've got some of the pressures on the inflation. It's really good. Can you explain to why that is?
if I could explain, I wouldn't be sitting here. I'd be in a desert island at the moment. So I'm sure William and Tamsin might have something to say on this as well. I'll answer your question from an actuarial funding level point of view, and that is that I guess the first point is the fund doesn't have, so what's it got in UK equities, maybe a third of this equities, so 17% thereabouts. So the fund's invested in lots of stuff, and only a portion of that's in the FTSE. But the fact that it's gone up by 10% is a good thing. The markets are a bit surprising because they sometimes don't react the way you think they're going to react, given all the other stuff that's going on. But I guess the FTSE hasn't really, if you look over the long term, it's not done very well in the last 10 years or so, has it? It's not moved much. And so some people might argue that I wouldn't argue it's undervalued, but maybe it was a few months ago, and now it's back to somewhere like it should be. Or it's difficult to answer that question. Inflation, I think, will come down. It's getting a bit more under control already. Our predictions are that it'll be down to sort of 6% by next summer, and then hopefully down to something like 3-4 by the following year, and then something back to normal. And therefore, again, that's probably helps buoy the markets when you get news like that coming through. But I don't know if anyone else would like to comment on the FTSE level question.
Just kind of just slightly, it's gone up actually 15% in 10 years. The FTSE,
Which isn't very good, really, is it?
that good. Yeah, you don't think that's good, but I think it's. I think it went down in 2019
Okay,
by 20%. All I'm saying is that things are looking good, looking better.
can I just bring William in? Because I mean, the whole point of this is that the fund is a long investment of a very, very long period of time, and there will be ups and downs in all the different types of investments that we have, and it's about understanding that longevity and that term, and actually having a well diversified portfolio, which gets all risks and all. So there might be issue where the market, as you've just said, goes down, but it's come back. And the whole point is not to panic and not to try and get wrapped into market disruption and variation. William, do you just want to, before I bring Councillor Waters back?
I was going to say very much what you've just said, Chair, that it's a long-term fund. We shouldn't pay too much attention to short-term. We have a working party this afternoon where we will be discussing the future and what might happen. But neither you nor I have any great kind of what's the word? We're not certain to be correct, either of us, I'm afraid.
Councillor Waters, did you want to come back?
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. It's about a different question, though, if that's okay. Moving on. Looking at your slide, I'm just interested in how you reconcile your assumptions for inflation to public sector pay awards in relation to pension contributions so that they're not disproportionate for members.
So I guess the first thing is that by members you mean employees, I'm guessing. So the employee contribution rate is set out in statute and the regulations. So the assumptions we make do not impact their costs, their contributions at all. LGPS is what we call a balance of cost scheme. So the total contribution rate that we calculate we deduct off the employee contributions, which are fixed, and then the employer pays the balance of cost. So nothing in this slide will impact employees. I think you asked me about the salary increase, so I'll run through the assumptions that we've increased inflation from 2.65 to 2.9. So it was 2.65 in 2019 up to 2.9. That might seem not enough, but remember, we're looking out 10, 20, 30 years. So that, to put that into context, is equivalent to being 10% this year, about 6% next year, and about 2.5% from year 3 onwards, so slightly less than that. Now, we've looked at lots of indicators, and in fact, 2.5% was slightly higher maybe than some other economic forecasters for the long term. But again, as it's been said already, it's not certain. We'll probably get it wrong, and that's why we carry out evaluation every 3 years to review, monitor, and adjust our assumptions. But the 2.9 covers the short-term high and the longer-term lower average. On salary increases, lots of news about everyone going to strike, want more money. We've already built in an increase which was applied backdated to last year, which was high for local government workers. And we think CPI plus 1, so 1% real increase, again in the long term, is a reasonable assumption to make. It probably hasn't been that for a while, but there'll be volatility. The peers will be very high maybe now, and then it will settle down again. And then the last assumption is what we call the discount rate. So that is a prudent assessment of the investment return. So in a prudent assessment, how we work this out is we look at the best estimate return for each asset you're holding over the long term. We then weight those best estimate returns by the proportion of assets you've got in each asset class, like equities and bonds and property. And by taking the product of those, we get the best estimate return. which I think was about 5.8% for your fund. But because we need to be prudent as actuaries, and Scottish, and we like looking after money, we slice a bit off and make a prudent assessment that the return will be 4.8% per annum going forward for the long term. And the last column just shows the impact on the liabilities and the contribution rates from each of those changes from 2019 to 2022. So in general, when inflation goes up, benefits are going to be higher and that costs more. So that pushes the liabilities up. And it works the opposite way for the discount rate. If the discount rate comes down, then that pushes the value of the liabilities up. And that's because you're assuming you're earning less money in the future to pay for them. So any questions on that?
Can I just come in and say that whole discussion doesn't just happen overnight?
No.
So you're working with officers and discussing all those things and employ about how they feel that is right for their part of the fund.
Yep. Okay. And the next, so that's the financial assumptions. The key demographic assumptions around longevity. So how long will people live? And this is a chart going back to 1980, which shows that squiggly line shows the rate of improvements each year. So if the squiggly line's above the horizontal, that effectively means people are living longer, and we expect people to live longer in the future than at that point in time currently. And you can see, I guess, if you drew a straight line through the jagged line, you can see an upward trend from 1980 to 2010. So in other words, people are living longer and longer, and that's probably no surprise to anyone. And in context, people are living about 2 years longer per decade, and have been for 100 years. But then in 2011, something strange started happening. The line started coming down and started trending down. So that's not to say people are living less time in the future. As long as they're above the horizontal, they're still living longer. But their rate of improvement was starting to slow down. And so this isn't just about the pandemic, which is obviously terrible for everyone, and saw a lot of people dying, a lot of excess deaths compared to normal. This is just because other trends, which we're still working on, but it'll be various things. Some people might cite the fact that we had a financial crisis in 2008-9, and therefore people were less affluent. There's specific cases where poor vaccines were given out by the NHS and so on. And the point being that we have relaxed our assumption for longevity such that we expect people to live slightly less now than we did 3 years ago. So it's kind of that smoothing off. We're still living longer, but not as long as we thought 3 years ago. So hopefully that makes sense, and to put that into context, we'll jump on, just in the interest of time, we'll jump that one. And to put that into context, this shows how long people are living, both at 2019 and now for two different ages and genders, age 45 and 65. So you can see, and the key point is in the last column, every number's negative. So people are living slightly less than we thought at 2019, which knocks about 4 to 5% off the liabilities because we're expecting to pay out pensions for slightly less time. So that's sort of, it's not good for the membership, but has had a benefit for the pension fund. So that's the assumptions. Move on to the results. So this is the whole fund results. So say we do this for every employer. But the good news is the fund has gone from a deficit, 450 million last 405 million, last time, up to a small surplus of 9 million. So you're now back to being fully funded. So fantastic news there. And that is because, well, I'll go into more detail in a second, but it's because the table on the right is because that shows the investment returns you've achieved over the last 3 years. And you can see that over the 3 years, the funds returned 23.2%. So just slightly under 8% per annum, about 7.5% per annum, and that was against our assumption of 4.8. So I said at the start, we always get it wrong. But as for the long term, so the fund has achieved an 8% gain on what we assumed at the last valuation, and that's taken the fund value up to, as I said earlier, almost 6.5 billion back at March 2022. So a really positive result. Funding level up from 93 to 100%. If we go on to the next slide, I'll just cover a couple more points. This is a busy slide, but it basically shows how we've gone from the 405 million deficit to the 9 million surplus, and I've just highlighted a few 4 key points. The first one is that all employers have been paying contributions in towards the deficit, so you've had a 95 million gain from that, so that's improved the position by 95 million. Just talked about the really strong investment returns, adding 434 million on top of what we'd allowed for, so really positive there. Unfortunately, with inflation going up, that's reduced the surplus and increased the liabilities a little bit. As you can see, the big red bar, so red's bad, green's good. And then the last chunky item is this lower life expectancy. So the fact people are living slightly less time than we thought 3 years ago, roughly reduces liabilities by 300 million. And then if we go on to the contribution rate, again, this is the primary rate only. So this is the cost of benefits accruing in the future. So the assets and what's happened in the past doesn't really impact this future cost. But you can see the cost has gone up slightly from 24.2% to 25.4%, so just about 1% higher. Again, back to this inflation point. See the average member rate's not really changed much, and therefore the balance of cost falls to the employers, and that's up about 1%. So cost of benefits up to about 19%. However, the improved funding position means that the secondary contributions will be lower, so we can keep the total contributions relatively stable. I've talked to this really, so we'll just skip on to the next one. So, if there's any questions on the contribution rates?
Can I just, that's an overall position. Obviously, it varies according to each employer.
Yeah. And that's a good plug, because that's the last slide is just on. We do this for every employer in the fund. Employers will be very different. They'll have different primary rates, as we call them. They'll have different funding positions and therefore different adjustments, secondary contributions. And the reason they're different is because, well, first of all, they'll have started from a different funding place 3 years ago. Everyone will be different at that point, and therefore they'll benefited more or less from, let's say, strong investment returns because they'd be better funded or not. When membership profiles are different, then that changes the cost to the future cost of that employer. Rule of thumb is if all your employees are very young, your cost will be cheaper, and that's because you've got longer to build up the assets, build up a pot to meet the benefits. So you've got a lot more time to pay contributions in and get investment returns for a 20-year-old member of staff than you do for a 60-year-old member. So the cost gradually increases as the membership profile increases. There'll be impact from the change in assumptions, of course, as we've talked about already. And then there'll be membership changes from 2019. So that you may have what we call a maturing of some employers. That is, there'll be a lot less actors than their relative to the pensions compared to 3 years ago, and that can change the profile and change the cost to employers as well. And lastly, is just the membership experience. So each employer will have awarded different salary increases. They may have had early retirements. Their membership may have differences in how long their members live, which we take into account. But the experience will always be the actual will always be slightly different from what we assumed. So it depends how each employer has moved relative to our assumptions. They will either gain or lose from those assumptions versus experience. So they'll all be in a slightly different place. But obviously we take all that into account and give them their own rate, unless they're pooled, of course, as I said at the start. And that's about all I was going to say. So I realise I'm over time. But happy to take any more questions.
Andre.
Yeah, just one thing, because being fully funded, it sounds really good, and from a place where we weren't fully funded 3 years ago, and now fully funded, um, that sounds like we've achieved a great deal in those 3 years. And how do we compare with other pension funds? And I'd just like to congratulate everybody in the pension team for the work they've put in to achieve that little bit. That's all.
Thank you, Andre, for taking that from me. I was about to do that.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Sorry.
I'll answer another point. I won't comment on the third point, but so the funding levels across the LGPS are up, generally because, back to the same points I've made, and that asset returns have been good across the LGPS in general, and probably other private sector schemes, well, particularly LGPS, because they are long-term investors and they've got more in growth assets and so on. So they've typically the funding levels are up by 7-8%, as in the same way that your fund is. I've analysed sort of 20 funds that we look after, and that's the case. So the average funding level is now up to something like 103% across the 20 funds that we have. And that's up from about 96, I think, last time. In the same way that all the primary contribution rates have gone up as well because of inflation. So they're all up a little bit. So it's the same sort of trends that you're seeing across the LGPS as well for Nottingham. Yes. No, I don't want to mention that. So, yes, Tamsin, I should mention it. The usual caveat, and you see in everything that's investment related, things can go down as well as up. We've been there. This is probably the best funding position we've had for 3, 4, 5 valuations, possibly since 2007. So it is nice. It's a nice problem to have, but absolutely right. We're not. This is just a point in time that's already moved since March, and it'll move again, and therefore we'll have to see what happens over the next few years.
Can I come in on that and say that for members of the public, we do have a working group this afternoon that will take some decisions on our investment strategy and asset allocations, and all of this will figure into the work we do, because we need to continue to perform, because we want to do even better. And I do thank the officers for all their very hard work in helping, and that's administration as well as investment, and also William, our advisor, for the work he's done, and our investment managers who do the day job in all the investment. So it is good news. Again, there's the caveat that things can change, but we need to keep on the good work we're doing. Thank you for that. Any other questions? Barry, have you got any final word to?
So I'll just finish off by saying the last steps now are just to finalise the funding strategy statement, put that out for consultation to employers, agree all the contributions with employers, which I think is largely done, and then draft the formal valuation report, and that'll be the valuation project complete.
Sorry, can I just make one point?
Yes, Councillor Chapman.
Coming back to contributions from employers, ever since I've been around, we've been increasing contributions, right? This is a year when it sounds okay. Does that mean that there's a chance of contributions for next year going down? Or are you going to take an ultra prudent view that actually it's status quo? Because I do know that some authorities, and I know it varies, it will vary according to funds, it will vary according to authority, but some authorities are actually getting the benefit of reduced pension contributions.
Yeah, so short answer is I think most of them are staying relatively fixed, much the same as we have, but there are some that can come down slightly. The reason we're obviously being cautious because we're just at 100%. There's no fat there. There's no extra surplus. And secondly, the primary rate has gone up. So the primary rate's gone up, which and the secondary rate's kind of disappeared, but it means we're pretty much where we were for most employers. But we're getting there, and hopefully, can start to see contributions levelling off now at least, and possibly come down in the future, notwithstanding that things can go down as well as up. The next, well, I can't tell you that because it depends. It depends how things pan out.
William.
Yeah, just kind of in response to Councillor Chapman's question, the other kind of input is actually the investment strategy. As a committee, you can choose to take a slightly higher risk investment strategy in the aim of getting higher returns. That may, if you're successful, mean lower contributions in the future, but not this time round.
That's where I'm coming from. I mean, we're on our uppers, all local government is on our uppers. We are making cuts to frontline services, right? And just tweaking, a little tweak here and there, right, can save several frontline services, right, on the assumptions. So that's what we're playing with. And I know it's very difficult. I know it's, finger in the air, a lot of it. But you've just got to understand what the consequences are of the rates we set. That's all.
Can I suggest? So I don't know what council you're from. You a chat. We can have a chat afterwards, offline. We can have a chat afterwards offline.
Okay, Councillor Longford, Sally.
Yeah. While we're on the subject of changing the way we invest, perhaps to in the light of the data that we've just heard about, perhaps we could look at moving to carbon neutrality a bit more quickly.
I'm sure you will be able to raise that this afternoon in the working group. Okay, I don't see any more indications. I'd just like to thank you, Barry, for all the hard work and your continuing work. And hopefully we'll like to wait for your final report in a few months' time. Thank you very much for coming along, and safe journey home. Yeah. I'm moving on to item number 6, which is the management and financial performance presentation. Our Group Manager of Financial Services, Keith Hoffman, will present the report. Keith.
Thank you, Chair. Just to say, this and the following presentations relate to information that's in the annual report. It's on the Pension Fund website. So we're just going to do a very brief summary of some of the information in that. I'd encourage you to have a look at the annual report, and obviously if you have any questions or any comments, let us know as a result of that. So I'm just going to run through some key figures from the accounts, highlighting the net additions and withdrawals from members, show the net returns on investments, a bit of an update on investment management expenses, very brief LGPS Central comment, and then just a summary at the end. So in terms of the pension fund key figures, this shows the net additions and withdrawals from dealings with members over the last 5 years, shows the net returns on investments and the closing net assets of the fund, and obviously highlights the actuarial funding level and the comments that Barry's just been making, showing that we've moved from 87% back in 17-18 up to 93% as it was at the end of 21-22, and then 100% as we've heard today. And again, the point that the funding level is just at a point in time, and it doesn't mean that necessarily we're on a trajectory upwards, but we're in a good place. So the next one shows net additions from members. So this increasingly, and we've said this in the past, will be a withdrawal going forwards. So you see that there's an outward cash flow trend over the period, but there has been a couple of years following valuations where we've seen significant input from scheme employers, where some of the larger employers have chosen to make an upfront payment for their secondary contributions, the deficit recovery bit, and that shows in 17-18 and 2021. There will be no similar payments in 22-23 because, as I've said, the secondary contributions have by and large fallen away. So although some employers do have small deficits still to fund, we're not intending that the big opportunity to pay that up front is just not worth it anymore, given the higher inflation and higher interest rates. Net additions from members, so it shows gross movements, and you can see that contributions no longer fully cover benefit payments. Again, 17-18 and 2021 were exceptions. But the net transfers in and out remain marginal. The amounts you're talking about in terms of the overall fund value are fairly small. But it does mean that in future we'll not be able to rely on member contributions to cover pensions, but we have significant investment income. And that's the focus that we have in the Pension Fund Committee and in the discussions this afternoon. So if you look at investment income, it shows a slight rebound in income in 21-22. Investment income remains available for use should contributions fall short of benefit payments. And as part of that conversation, obviously there's no asset sales. The investment income is covering any shortfall of member contributions, so we're not eating into our assets at all. Next one shows net returns on investments. The volatility is shown by this chart, so market values are reflected in the changes in value figures. So you can see that those fluctuate significantly, and that's something everyone will be familiar with. But the chart illustrates the continued recovery in valuation from low asset prices at the end of 1920. So the 1920 reductions were recovered and have continued to grow during the last 2 years. Next one shows investment management expenses. So the stability of the fund's investment arrangements has helped keep investment costs low. Direct investment management expenses have increased slightly over the last year. So you'll see that's in absolute terms, millions is the bars, and the line shows percentage of the total. And over time, we've been able to reduce fee rates as we negotiate lower fees, and we benefit from the negotiating power of LGPS Central. Although it should be noted that there are additional fees and charges through pooled investment vehicles, and these are the effect of reducing the fair value of the investments. They're not shown as specific costs, but are part of the overall picture. And the estimated embedded cost within pooled investment vehicles is around 15 million in 21-22 compared to 13 million in 2021. But we're continuing to work on improved transparency so that we more accurately report fees. Just a very brief update on asset pooling. People will be aware that we've been part of investment LGPS Central Pool since April 2018, and we continue to use them where appropriate to manage our assets. And we currently invest in corporate bonds, emerging market equities, passive global equities, active global equities. So there's a list there of those. And they also, as you know, currently manage our gilts mandate. But the responsibility for asset allocation remains with the Pension Fund Committee, and that will be part of the discussion this afternoon. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Keith. I'd like to open up any questions or comments from members. Officer? No, I don't see any indications. Thank you, Keith, for your report. Now move on to item number 7, which is investment performance and pension and treasury management presentation. Senior accountant Tamsin Rabbits will deliver the presentation. Thank you, Tamsin.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry, I'm trying to work the slides. Right, so I'm Tamsin Rabbits and I'm the investment manager for the Nottinghamshire Pension Fund. Today I'm going to talk about the returns delivered by the fund's investments over the year to March 2022 and how these investments are managed. The equities, property and bonds figures indicate the performance against benchmark of our main asset classes. Against all periods, the total fund return is ahead of the assumed investment returns in the triennial valuation. Each quarter, the Pension Fund Committee reviewed the performance of the fund and received reports from each of the main portfolio managers. During the year, the fund retained a relatively simple structure of management arrangements with 2 main equity portfolios, the Core Index and Schroders, increasing holdings through LGPS Central as part of the LGPS pooling process, and mainly direct property managed by Aberdeen Standard. The specialist portfolio holds a number of pooled funds in a variety of assets. Each fund is externally managed but overseen in-house. Each of the main managers has an individual benchmark against which their performance is measured. The fund's overall performance is then compared to its strategic benchmark and helps to inform decisions around the management arrangements. The strategic benchmark is built up of high-level market indices for different asset classes. The benchmark is based on the agreed asset allocation. The fund's asset allocation is one of the key factors that the committee determines, and this is recognised as the biggest driver of returns. The fund then decides how each asset class should be managed. For example, segregated mandate or external managers on a passive or active basis. The performance of the main managers is reported to committee each quarter. A review of asset allocation took place during the year which proposed some changes which have been approved and implemented during the current financial year. Or that financial year. It's now the previous financial year. The figures above represent the allocation which applied during most of the last financial year. This graph of the performance of the passive core index is a good indication of how volatile the stock market can be, indicating that however good one year's results were, they may be significantly different in the future. The Schroders portfolio is similarly volatile. As an actively managed portfolio, performance will vary from the benchmark. The property graph clearly shows the impact of lockdown restrictions to combat the spread of COVID-19 virus in the last quarter of 1920 and ongoing through 2020 and the early part of 2021, impacting portfolio performance, particularly for consumer-facing industries. A strong recovery was experienced during 21-22, driving this year's performance figures. The LGPS Central portfolio has only been in existence for 2 years. This graph will become more interesting over time. Where future investments are made through the LGPS Central Asset Pool, decisions over manager selection will be made by the pool operator, but deciding on an appropriate investment strategy and asset allocation for the fund will still be done by the Nottinghamshire Pension Fund Committee, and this is the most important factor in driving long-term investment returns. So to summarise, the recovery following the global pandemic continued during the year, but increased volatility has been experienced. Consequently, the fund's net assets increased during 21-22, and the total returns over 5 years are ahead of the actuary's assumed return. And asset allocation remains the most important factor in driving long-term investment returns. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Tamsin, for the report. I know that the vast majority of that is the previous financial year, and we are continuing that work after this meeting today. Any questions, comments from members, please? I don't see any. Okay, thank you very much, Tamsin. We'll move on to our administration team's report, please, and it will be delivered by Sarah Stevenson and John Clues in a short moment.
Okay, shall I? Yep.
I just think we need to get this for the members of the public to be able to see it. Sorry, for anybody watching from outside, all these reports will be published on the website.
Sorry about that. So moving forward, this has been another challenging year for pensions administration. The national pensions landscape continues to set the fund challenges. So in context, our scheme membership continues to grow. And I'm always reporting this, but we're working quite closely with multi-academy trusts, which are consolidating into single scheme employers, and we've had a number of employers come into the scheme. The pension regulator continues to require funds to work on improving our fund data, and that's been reported to the Pensions Committee over the last year. The pension fund admin team are undertaking office and home working, so we're still in that position. And as we've already reported previously, the fund has recruited some additional resources to work on MacLeod National Project, and there are further recruitment is being planned However, all funds, and I say all LGPS funds, are reporting difficulty in recruiting appropriate staff, and we continue to see that.
Can I come in on that, John? Just as a positive. So, anybody out there watching this meeting, anybody in the meeting, working in the pension industry is a really interesting industry and has great career prospects. So, if anybody out there is interested, please get in touch, and we'll show you what those opportunities present.
Thank you, Chair. So, moving on to pension fund statistics, as already said, this just gives you an update of where our statistics are at this particular point in time. Moving on to the next slide. And this goes back to Councillor Chapman's question. As you can see, each year the pension fund undertakes its year-end activity, and last year was no exception. But obviously, we undertook work on the valuation as well. We set a date of which submission information is required. We do presentations to scheme employers leading up to that date, and try to get them to work towards providing the data as early as possible. There has been some improvements over the years, and there's been some fallbacks. There are a number of some of our larger employers, should I say, who have failed to provide information by the deadline, and even leading right up to the production of our benefit statements. We are actually, and I was discussing this morning, we will be writing out to 22 scheme employers this year and charge them additional costs for additional work that we've had to undertake. So you can see that is something that we take quite seriously. So moving on. So all employers submitted, as I said, all employers submitted their data to enable submission of the valuation and annual benefit statements. We do continue to work with scheme employers, and because we were granted additional resources, we have put some of that into the employer support and compliance team, and they are actually undertaking some employer audits over the coming year to work with employers and to look at their data. Just as a thing, we actually issued 44,000 deferred statements in July and 37,000 active statements in August, with a follow-up of 2,000 follow-up statements in November. The valuation data was issued to the actuary in August 2022 with an agreed within the agreed deadline, and we issued 188,000 rows of data. We'd actually started working on that data, I think it was about November 2021, if I can get my years right. So moving on. So compliance, as I say, the employer support and compliance team work with employers. We ensure that statutory requirements are met, that overall quality entitlements continues to be improved. We offer support and advice, and as I said, we will send notifications where employers have not complied. Moving on. This is just an indication of our cost per member. Unfortunately, I'm unable to give you 2022's. We've been chasing SITFA, our benchmarking club, for all the information, and we were actually provided with some information this morning, but I wasn't confident enough to put that into the slide. So, looking at 2021, we're looking at around £14 cost per member, with an average of £21 across the benchmarking club. So we are significantly under the cost. Now that will have changed for 2022 because we have incurred some additional costs, but as I say, I'm not able to give you any accurate figures on that, and I will report that at a later date once I'm confident with those. Okay, moving on. So just for some information regarding some of our other benchmark, which we actually record. There's no other way of saying it, but deaths, our activities on deaths. We've seen a significant increase in deaths, certainly over the pandemic, and we're still seeing an increase over the last year. We're around 13% above the number of deaths that we had prior to the pandemic, and we've seen it very much fluctuate with the national trends. So as you can see, we're around 89%. It's one of our top, I suppose, processes that we work on. Retirements as well. We've seen increase in retirements over the year, and again, it's one of our high priorities for the fund, and we're at 85%. Deferment, as you'll see, we're down to 2%. This is one of those processes that we put aside. It's where we process leavers, and so unfortunately we are well below our KPI on that, and we have put some further resource into that particular area. Deferred retirements, we've seen an increase in retirements of deferred members, and those are people who are now deciding to take their pensions very much earlier than they probably would expect. We can only say that that's probably down to the current financial position and just people obviously wanting to access their pension benefits early. Can you go to the next slide, please? Transfers, again, we are below our KPI on this. That's generally because of really prioritising other areas of work, and also of retraining new staff in transfers, and so that's where we are. Refunds, a lot of members who have decided to come out of the scheme have been seeking refunds. We are actually fully up to date on those, and then I've put in divorce quotes, but there's slightly minor processes really compared to some of the major activities that we actually do. So moving on, just as a sort of conclusion really to that, in the pandemic we saw a reduction in our output. That was mainly due to moving across to home working, and the first 3 or 4 months of the pandemic, where we had difficulties with our systems, but they were resolved. And as you can see, 21-22, we've seen an increase in our output of processes over that year, and that continues to grow. And hopefully, if we are able to recruit new staff, that will further increase. So planned activities for the coming year, or couple of years I should say. We are continuing with the McLeod project that's well underway, and we're starting to see data come in from scheme employers. We are planning to move to monthly returns, and this again answers some Councillor Chapman's question, as this will enable us to have earlier sight of data coming forward. We've had to wait for that due to software changes in our admin system, but we're due to start to have meetings with our software provider in the coming months, and then start to bring some of the larger employers onto monthly returns. That is going to be challenging because it's like doing a year end every month, and as it's been reported by other funds, it is a challenging activity over the first year or so. We've reported on the data improvement plan, and this is ongoing, and we are preparing for the National Pensions Dashboard, and we have some various other pension administration system improvements planned in. So I think that's my last slide.
Do we have any questions for John before we hand over to Sarah? Thank you very much. Councillor Moore, good.
Just a quick one, Mr. Chairman. Home office working from home, working back in the office. Is that heading towards a permanent situation, or are you gradually moving back to working from the office?
It's going to be a mixed economy, to be honest, Councillor. We're doing quite a lot of training in the office, and the team are coming in, and probably we're seeing more pensions admin team in than some of the other teams. So it is going to still be a mixed economy, though, but certainly going forward, it's very difficult to predict. We're just following the county council's policy, to be honest.
I just noticed the car park was a lot busier than it could be.
Oh, right.
And, I know our district council now, we're expecting staff to come in at least 2 days into the office.
I agree with that.
Sarah, would you like to?
John's complete statement.
She's on yours as well. Okay, thank you. I don't see any. Oh, sorry, Councillor Chapman.
Yeah, it's the table to do with performance benchmarking and costs. From 2021, it looks like you're 66% cheaper. Sorry, you're 33% cheaper than everybody else.
Yeah.
Right. Now, if somebody's cheap, you can draw one or two conclusions.
Yep.
One, you're very efficient, right? And exceptionally efficient. I mean, 33% is a lot. Or two, you're understaffed, and there's an actual cost to the pension fund from your understaffing.
Yeah.
And given the marginal cost of administration compared with turnover and everything else, if that's the case, then it would seem to be a very poor way of managing. From our point of view, not from yours, right? From our point of view, which one is it?
Well, as I said earlier, the committee did grant some additional resources, so we're actually up to and slightly over our establishment, because we've increased our establishment. We have, I think it's a further, just off the top of my head, 5 or 6 posts yet to recruit, which we are finding very difficult to recruit to. And all funds are experiencing that. We are trying to do something about that, in that we're going to be working with Derbyshire and Leicestershire and some of our other local funds to see what we can do in relation to apprenticeships and further recruitment. And I actually went to the Pension Managers Conference in November and presented a paper and workshop on recruitment and apprenticeships. So it's been actually highlighted up to the LGA, and we have been seeking support in terms of what can be done nationally around the recruitment difficulties that the LGPS funds are actually experiencing. So,
to full complement, would that be a comfortable place to be? Is that the right place
yes,
to be?
it would. Yes, absolutely.
Right. So basically, you could still be cheaper than everybody else, but you'd be more comfortable with what you're doing.
Well, we would be. Yes, we would. Yes, that's possibly the case. Yes.
There we go. That will do. Thanks.
Sarah, do you want to come in on that, please? I think we put it in the context that if you've been to all of seen our pension committee meetings in the past, there's been several developments over the last year. So these are the year-end 22 accounts. There have been several changes in the staffing level, recruitment processes we have to do, like GMP, McLeod, dashboard, all that kind of. So, Sarah, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I would add that it's not just about bodies in the team, it's about how we use the technology. Before, I've spoken about that at committee before. So it is about how we receive the data, the accuracy of the data, because if the data is not accurate, then we're having to touch activity more than once. So the move, obviously, that big piece of work we've been doing over the last few years around data improvement has had a significant investment by the fund, but also in resourcing as well. That then moves us, as you know, the plans are to move to monthly returns. So that should then mean once we've got monthly returns, we're starting to bulk process things such as levers. So you have one person touching many activity, because in a digital world, that's where we have to be. And as digital progression, and that transformation changes, I think the personnel that we have to look at how we utilise them for the more complex cases. So straightforward activity needs to be bulk processed in the system. So I think for me, it's a combination of both. And I don't know that we should just see because our figure is lower than the average, because I'm not comfortable that necessarily comparing apples and apples with what they submit. I think the other thing is that our administration service sits as part of the business service centre, and therefore the fund benefits from economies of scale by utilising some of those other teams where we have done significant transformation over time as well. So things such as, at the moment, we continue to have a paper-based retirement application. Behind the scenes, we've developed an online application, therefore it does various checks. Those checks don't have to be done by a person, and we're going to look to trial that initially with the county council. But I think also picking up, Councillor Chapman, on your comment about the valuation and getting that information out, I think it is, as John said, on those year-end figures, the scheme employers have key roles to play here. So we have to look at both sides of that story. And I think as we develop our admin performance report, we have to start to report in more detail into committee about the performance of individual scheme employers, and therefore what action the fund will support the admin team to take against those scheme employers to make those improvements in scheme employers' responsibilities as well. Okay.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I'll bring Councillor Intro the mic in.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, John, Sarah. Thanks for the report. I've just got one comment and a question around the pension fund member statistics, if I may. So what we've seen over the last 4 years is an increase in pensioners as a proportion of the fund of going up from 26.6 to 28.6%. And in terms of active members, that number dropping from 34 to 29.6. So 4.4% in absolute terms. So want to congratulate the team on the fact that the investments are doing so well and the fund is doing so well. But in a backdrop where we've got increasing liabilities in terms of the pensioners and decreasing active members at the moment, just how do you see that proportion developing over the next few years? Thank you.
That's a really good question.
Well, the pension statistics are always working. These are always moving because we've got members coming in, we've got members going out, we've got deferreds, and it's a shifting thing. It's very difficult to answer. What we have seen and the reasons they have increased is the MATs and the multi-academy trusts and the numbers that they're bringing in, and they're consolidating their establishments. And we had just off the top of my head, we had 4 or 5 from Derbyshire that came in. We had 2 or 3 from Leicestershire, and 1 or 2 from around the back, because the Mats are consolidating all their records. So that's why you see some movement in that. And there's a big question mark nationally about schools and multi-county trusts and what they see. But going forward, I think we'll see a levelling off of the date of our membership. We've got some, and I did actually mean to mention, we have got some funds that are closing, and some employers that are closing and are moving out. So there's always this movement around the fund, and that's why it's really important that when we come to the valuation, that we're able to consolidate that data and check that data and make sure, for example, that that employers have provided us with leaver information, for example. So we're not showing actives, but we're showing leavers and deferreds, and that's where monthly returns is going to help us to keep that data up to date. Because I'll put my hand up. Some of those actives, I suspect, would have been leavers, but we wouldn't have been told that they were leavers, if you see what I mean. So it's a shifting landscape.
Sarah, did you indicate to come in?
Yeah, I was going to really pick up on that table, Councillor and Trainer, where you can see the increase in members who are actually actively taking their pension. I think what would be useful is actually we need to look at, see if we can break down that particular line to show if you've got retirements from active or retirements from deferred, because I think we have seen an increase, a significant increase during COVID of people who were holding a deferred pension with the scheme, putting that into payment. So I think that will give us a different sort of view, because then you look at the actives to retirement from your active membership rather than your deferreds as well. So I think we should have a look to see if we can do that. I think the other thing, having presented recently at the HR networking meeting, which is a meeting of all district, county councils, city councils and boroughs, is actually how we consider, both as scheme employers but also as a fund, how we continue to promote the benefits of the scheme. And I think the other thing is that the LGPS is quite unique in public sector schemes in offering the 50-50 option. So where you may have a cost of living, rising and people reviewing, what they are spending their money on, actually, I think there is something for us to do about advertising that 50-50 option. So rather than people coming out of the fund completely, they retain a stake within the fund and pay 50% contribution. And actually that they can actually have some movement between those. And then obviously you do have some high earners who are affected by, tapered allowances and things like that, where again we may need to consider what support we give them to retain their membership within the scheme rather than opting out. So I think there's a number of things we need to look at over the next year.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. We'll take a look at that, Michael. I'm sure we're very interested to progress that. Did you want to?
I just say I do appreciate it's a pretty multifaceted conversation, but thanks very much for the answers and well done again.
Sue, you indicated.
Yes, so thank you. So my comment was really going back to the discussion about performance. I just wanted to take the opportunity to say, as a scheme employer, that despite the recruitment challenges that I know the team have faced and the complexity of the administration itself, we enjoy a particularly collaborative relationship from my point of view. So we've continued to receive that service during the period. And as an employer, we would welcome feedback on our performance, because anything that might result in efficiencies for you would also result in efficiencies for us. So it is a high priority. So I just wanted to take the opportunity to thank you as well for the support during the year.
Thank you for that, Sue. William, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I was just going to add a little bit of context to Councillor Troner's question. At a national level, the LGPS is definitely becoming more mature, i.e. fewer active and more pensioners. This fund is relative to the average kind of less mature, i.e. we have more active and less and fewer pensioner members. If you go back to the Keith's presentation on the contributions, there's a very clear trend towards going towards net contributions coming down. Sorry, net in payments coming down, and it's something we're going to be discussing at the working party this afternoon because that has an impact on the strategic asset allocation. We need to take more income out of investments, or at least have the potential to do that.
Thank you for that, William, putting it in context. Absolutely. I don't see any more indications, so thank you very much, John, Sarah, for your presentations. We'll now move on to item number 9, which is questions. We didn't have any questions by the time 10 days before, and I don't believe we've had any since. I think that's the case. So I think that means that that item is closed, and I'd like to thank committee members, officers, everybody else for coming along, and I formally close the meeting. And just remind everybody that we do have a working group in not too distant future in committee room B. Thank you.